Today topic is Anglo forms. Handling user input with forms, and then the forms are usable and scalable and testable. So Angular provides us two different approaches to handle the user inputs with forms, that is template driven and reactive. Both captures the input, validates the input, and create a form model and data model to update and track the changes. So Angular provides us that two different type of forms, and reactive forms and template driven forms. That is template driven forms. How to create a form in HTML? We create a form in HTML with the form tag. So Angular automatically by default it attaches ng form directory to form tag. So ng form directory allows us to register the child controls. So for each form input, that is form holds the controllers that are created for the elements with ng model directive and name attribute, and monitors their properties including their validity. So sorry, each form input binds through the model through ng model directive. To create a form control instance for the form input element, we need to assign a value to the name attribute of that ng model directive. So the name is the input property of ng model directive. We need to assign a value to that name attribute so that Angular creates the form control instance for that input element, the register form input with the form with the value passed to the name attribute, so that form can have a so that form will have access to the form input element, and that form monitors their input element properties including their validity. So that is form has its own valid property. It is true only if every contained control is valid. So form monitors that validation status of the form input element, and that sets the valid property of form. That is the form, the ng form directive can export to the template reference, and that template through that different template reference we can access that valid property of that form. So valid property of the form is set to true only if all child controls valid property is true. Template driven forms are driven by the ng model directive. So these directive which we use on the template, and that so these are template driven forms. Reactive forms are model driven forms, and we model driven forms, and we group the child control through form group model, and that form group model instance is bind to the form by form group directive. So reactive forms are model driven forms, and reactive forms provides us that reactive form module. As part of that, it provides form group directive and form group model. So in form group model, we define the child controls, and that form group model to bind to the form we use form group directive. So form group instance is bound to the form element with the form group directive. So form group instance track the state of form of a group of form control instance. So each control for the for each input element in the form, each input element in the form we bind to the form control instance, and that form control instance is provides. So that form control instance, while defining the form control in the form group, we define with the name and then name as a key and value as form control instance. The form control instance, we define their functions, validator functions, and that form control instance is returns the validity of that data, and that is that we track by the name which is provided while defining the form control instance. So binds to the form input with the form control name directive. That is that we define a form control instance in the form group in model, and that form control instance is bind to the form input by form control name directive. So form control communicate changes to group instance and provide the source of truth for the model. So we define a form control instance within a form group model so that when there is a change in the child control, it communicates to the form group instance. So that's why the form group model is the source of the truth. So if you would like to get a value of that particular child control and or validity of that child control data, we access through form group model. So let's see how to define a child control for a form input element in template driven forms. So with template driven forms, we create a forms with a form tag, and then within that form tag we'll have a child controls, that is form input element, and that is the binds that form input element with the model with the ng model directive. Here that ng model directive is bind to the name property of the model class, and to register this form input with the form we provides the name to the name input property of ng model directive, that is in this case full name, so that angler register the form input element with the full name so that form can monitor the properties and validity of the form input element. So that is angler creates a form control instance with ng form directive that is attached to the form tag, and form control register and the name assigned to the name attribute. So how the data flow between the model and view in template driven forms. So this is ng model driven form. So Angler uses the control value accessor to listens for the form input element, and that control value accessor notifies the ng model directive. So the ng model directive gets the value and binds the data to the model, and also control value accessor sets the value on the form control instance, because angler creates the form control instance, and so that for each form input element that registered to the form, so control value accessor also sets the value of form control instance, and the value observable emits the values so that subscribers to that value observable receives the values. So in reverse way, that is when there is a change in the model, when there is a change in the model, ng model directive change detector detects the change and it triggers, it calls the callback method ng on changes, and once the change detector completes, it sets the value on the form control instance, and the form control instance value changes observable emits the values and to the subscribers of that value change observable, and the control value accessor sets the value on the form input element. That is the since one control value accessor is a bridge between ng model and form input element. So let's see that how to define a control in reactive forms. So reactive forms are model driven forms. So we define a control in the model and respect and their validity validator functions in the model, and that model instance is bind to the form input element. See here that we define a form group element in model, and within that we define a two child controls the name. We have a that form group object have two elements, and that name is the key first name and value as the form control instance, and last name value as the form control instance. So this first name is bind to the respective form element with the form control name directive. So Angular provides us that form control name directive to bind the form control instance to the form input element, which is under form group one form, and that form is bind to the form group in form group model through form group directive. That see that form in first statement form group directive and pass the form group model instance, that is the profile form. So it binds to the form group instance, and within the form group we define the form control instances, that is first name which is tracked by the name first name and last name, and that bind to that respective form input elements by form control name directive. So that form group control communicates the form group model, so that form group model we access the value of any of the form input element through form group instance. See that here that form control directive is to form the layer between the form input element and form control instance. If there is any change in the form input element, that is user enter the data on the form input element, that that emits the value, and that control value accessor listens to that, and control value accessor sets the data on the form control instance, so that value change observable emits the values and subscribers is receives the values. So in that way, so when there is a change in the model, we sets the value on the form control instance, so that it value change observable emits emits the value to the subscribers of value change observable, and control value accessor sets the value on form input. So this is what as part of Angular reactive forms, and Angular provides us these directives, that is form control directive, form control name, group directive, form group name, and form group array name. So form control directive without if you want to use standalone form input elements without the part of form group model, so we use form control directive to bind that respective form control instance defined in the component. So that is syncs a standalone form control instance to a form control element. So form control name directive we use to bind the form control instance which is defined as a part of form group instance. So in that case we use form control name directive instead of form control directive, that is syncs the form control in existing form group instance to form a form control element by name. That is, we register the form control instance with the name. So the form group will have a nested group, and each group binds to the respective form group instance, that is by form group name directive. So form array name is syncs the nested form array instance to the DVM element. So instead of defining a form group and instead of defining a form group instances in a form group model, so Angular provides us that we can you can define a form instances in a array, so that we don't need to provide that name of that each form control instance, that is tracked by the index of that form array, and then that form array we can bind to that form input elements there through form array name directive, and that each form control instance is tracked by the index. So Angular provides us that the abstract control class, which is actually implements inheritance all form control and form group and form array inheritance. This abstract control call, these are validator functions class also, which is it is a part of abstract control, and then so we can provide that validator functions in the form control. So form control, so it is manages the value and validator status of that individual form control, and form group model manages the form group class manages the value and validity of the group of that abstract control instances, that is group of form control instances, and form array manage the value and validity state of numerically indexed array of abstract control instances, that is form control inherited the abstract control, so that form control will can define the validator functions for that form input element which is bind to that. And form builder is to provide easy way to define the form control instance instead of defining the form control instance for each element, and it provides the factor method so that it is easy to define that form control instance. So till now we have seen that how to bind the data between the form input elements and with the template with the model. So let's see that how to validate the data, how we validate the data. So that is in template driven form. So ng model directive used to bind the data with the model, and ng model is inherit the abstract control, and abstract control provides the validator functions returns the value when there is a change in the data. So how we get that, how we access that validator properties, and that we done by import that ng model directive to template reference. In this case we import with the name template reference, so that ng model implements the abstract control, and abstract control class provides the validator properties, so that through that validator properties we can access through template reference. So here that we property called invalid and dirty and touched. So we have used that, we can validate that and display respect, we can customize that to display the message on the user info on the page. See that there is here we check for the whether the data entered on the input element is valid or not, and we check for only when it is touched, then only we display message, and it is checked for that when you define a required, and the user must enter some data, otherwise we display message name is required, and we check for the minimum length. We provide the minimum length 4 characters long, and that we check for that minimum length attribute, and the forbidden name, that is forbidden name is that custom validator. We define that forbidden name validator, we create the forbidden name validator, and which extends the validator function back to validator class, and we need to register with the ng validator, so that and those ng validator, so that we can check, we can get the reference to that validator through this template driven template reference variable. So reactive forms validation is that, so we define a form control instance which is bind to that form input element through model. So it is model driven, and we define a form control instance, and first argument is that uh, the initial value, and second is the array which we can define the validators for that. It is required minimum length, and this is the custom validator, so we can give that custom validator like this. And so we, so how the template can, how the template can have a access on that. So in the template driven, we import that ng model directive through the template reference. Through template reference, we got access to that validator properties. But in reactive forms, so we get the validator properties through form control instance, and then we set the getters, and then that getters returns the value through form group instance, and get the respective form control instance, and that will be written, so that we can access to the getter names through in template. So here name and power is the getters, so we can access the form control instance through that getter name, and power, we get access to the template can access to the form control instance through getter name power. So here that, so template is directly accessing the with the name, the getter names, and it is validated. So that is form driven. So this is template driven. So validator functions, we have two types of validator functions, that is which is passed as a second argument of form control instance, that is immediately written either set of validation errors or null. And async validators, actually it is a third property of that form control instance. It returns observable and later emits the set of validation errors or not. So to conclude that there is an errors, and it depends on the data. So these observables gets the data, observable data from the network, through network or through database, and then once they get the data, and depends on that data, we validate the user enters the data, validate against the database data, so then emits the values, and that emits the values of validation of that, decides the validation of that data, so it emits the errors. So that is async validators. So this here that form control validator directive is the custom validator directive, and that we registered with the provider, uh, so that is ng validator, so that it is available as if that built-in validators, so that we give it in the form control instance. So custom validator functions at group level, for example, to con to say that validation of that data, that is the data entered on the form control input, and that is full name, and that depends on that alter ego form control instance. So that if it is depends on that other siblings of that form control instance, that we define it in a as in the group level, that we define like this. And validators and custom validator is identify reveal validator, and reveal validator will have access to the form control instance name and alter ego, and that, so it depends on that both values of that particular point of time, so that it returns the errors. So to define the form group validators at the group level, in this way we can define. And then the second point here is that, so custom validators in the group level, the form level, we in template driven forms, we can include the directive on that form tag. So this is all about forms, and forms, template driven forms, reactive forms. Template driven forms are driven by the ng model directive, and reactive forms driven by the model. So as for reactive forms, Angular provides us that different directives called form group directive, form control name directive, and then using that directives we binds the model to the form template elements. And then, so in interactive forms we define that validators is sync validators, async validators in model, that is through form control instance. So this is all about the rack, the forms, and most useful forms are reactive forms. And so thank you.